How's everybody doing tonight? It's good to see everybody. And tonight we're continuing our theme of heroes and villains of the Bible. And tonight is Moses and Pharaoh. And it's definitely one of the more popular stories in the Bible, I think. Part of it anyway. And so that's what we'll be looking at tonight. And I think it's pretty obvious which one's the hero and which one's the villain. But if we start at the beginning, at their birth, what's the big obvious difference between their births? Birth, like when they were born. Well, you know, one is, and I don't know how to ask it without giving it away, but one was obviously born rich, and one initially was born poor, you know, as a slave. There's really nothing written about Pharaoh's, hope that's not a sign of the class, but hopefully, but there's really nothing written about Pharaoh's birth, but just because of who Pharaoh is or was, and what we know about the position of Pharaoh and the royalty, you know, we can assume he was born into wealth, spoiled probably, had everything he needed or wanted growing up. You know, we can compare that today. Well, you know, everybody's born into different situations. And that's one thing we notice is as we grow up, you know, we get to make our choices how we turn out. It doesn't have to be because we were born into what family. So that's just a quick, you know, initial observation is both of them were born into two different scenarios. But if we look at Moses' birth, and you had to pick one word to kind of describe or classify his birth, what would be a one-word description of his birth, besides poor? I already said poor. Providence. Okay, providence is one, and that wasn't where I was going yet. But we will get to providence later in the lesson. But that's a good one. Stealth is definitely a good one. Love. Well, there's definitely some love with his parents. The word I thought of was illegal. Because if we look at it, he wasn't supposed to live. And his parents, because of love and stealth, kept him alive for 3 months. And it got to the point they couldn't hide him, so they put him in an ark, put him in the river. His sister kind of babysat him. And, of course, Pharaoh's daughter found him, saw him. And, you know, she kind of went and talked. And I don't know if trickery is the right thing. Definitely some providence was involved. But his mom got to be the nurse and nurse him, you know, till he was ready to come and be her son. We're not told exactly how long that was, and commentaries have all kinds of reasons for different years. Some of them went as long as 7 years before he went to be Pharaoh's daughter's son, if that's proper grammar. But so he definitely got some Hebrew raising before he went to live in the house of Pharaoh. But we could definitely say his birth was illegal because we see the situation with the midwives. We're told to kill the boys as they were born, and of course they didn't. And Pharaoh wasn't real happy. God blessed them because of that. And then the chapter ends, the very last verse says Pharaoh made a law that every boy that was born had to be thrown in the river. And of course his parents, starting in the beginning of chapter 2, saw that he was a fair child or a goodly child, and they hid him. And, of course, then the rest is history. So, you know, we definitely see that as a big difference in the two people's birth. But what is a lesson we can learn from that, from what his parents did? Several, but... All right, yes. They did what was right and trusted God. Yeah, so they twisted it a little bit. Delayed obedience. But, you know, we can see that they definitely put God's law first. You know, a lot of times when we look at our lives, especially the last 2 years, if we look at all the things the government's told us to do and not do, and they change their mind and things change, and we see a lot of people live in fear instead of just doing what they know is right. There is no way you could exist the last 2 years and not realize that somebody's trying to get rid of Christianity in this country. So there's definitely a fight that we're all involved in, and there comes a time in your life sometime when you've got to stand up, whether you end up getting punishment for it or not. There's a line you've got to stand on and pick right or wrong. And we see lots of examples of that in the Scriptures. I picked out a couple. In Acts 5, we see some of the apostles got arrested, or not arrested, but the Jewish council brought them in. And in verse 28, the high priest said, "Didn't we strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us." And then in verse 29, we're all familiar with Peter's response. He said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." And of course, then the council starts debating amongst themselves. Gamaliel gets up, and he was real respected and had a little speech, and everybody agreed with him. And in verse 40 through 42, it says that they agreed with him, and when they had called the apostles and beat them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. And they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house they ceased not to teach and preach Jesus Christ. So some things to notice there. Of course, they said we obey God rather than men. We quote that a lot, but we don't always live it, and that's a very generic statement. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but it's definitely harder to live than to say that statement. And in verse 42 or verse 40, we see that they threatened them, but then it says they beat them before they released them. So obeying God instead of men definitely took some punishment and some pain to fulfill that statement. So doing the right thing isn't always painless. Sometimes there's problems with it. In Hebrews 11:23, talking about Moses' parents, it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment." So there we see there was a commandment, and they were obviously breaking it, but they weren't scared of the king. They were going to do what was right. Obviously, killing your child is going to violate God's law. So they were going to obey that. Definitely your child, it's easier to I guess, stand up for your child than someone else's. I think it's pretty safe to say, but it's still going against the king's command. But they said it was, the writer of Hebrews says they were not afraid of the king's commandment. And, just over the last couple of years, we've had to realize 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of sound mind." So we've got to make sure we have that same attitude, that we're going to do what's right no matter what the consequences are. That's kind of the definition of integrity, doing what's right no matter if somebody's watching or not. The fact is God's always watching us. God knows if we're doing right or wrong. 1 Corinthians 16:13, Paul says, "Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, and be strong." So the first lesson for us is to be brave and do what's right, regardless of the consequences, because our life is always going to throw hurdles in front of us that make life uncomfortable. So it's important, and that's kind of learning from his parents and not from Moses, but we can see the precedent set early in his life, to do the right thing. And we'll see later, as Chris said, there's definitely some providence involved in that, and we'll see that in a little while. As far as we looked at earlier, how his sister was involved and his mom got involved in raising him initially, what's another lesson we can learn this early on in Moses' life, as far as us as parents? They didn't get to raise him his whole life, but it doesn't tell us how long, but his mom was involved in raising him initially. And Proverbs 22:6 tells us, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart it." Now, that's not a command that means, your kid will never fall, never go the wrong direction. But it's a proverb, something we should strive and live by. And we can see this is definitely part of Moses' life, that he had that early upbringing, I guess you could say. So he knew he was a Hebrew, an Israelite, and knew where he was from, even though he spent the majority of his life up to a certain point in the house of Pharaoh. He still had that early upbringing from his mom to where he knew where he was from and who he was. And he was more of an adopted child of Pharaoh's daughter. Yeah, very, very true. And Ephesians 6:4 says, "Ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." We don't really read anything here about his father being involved in those early years, but I think we all understand verses like this can definitely be generically applied to both parents. And we have a verse telling us that his mother was involved, and there had to be some discussion of God and how the Israelites were God's people and different things, because we know his decision later in life was based on suffering with the people of God and not with the riches of Pharaoh. So we know there had to be some admonition in the Lord of some sort in those first few years. How many times, before we move on from his early years, how many times in the last few years, even as long as 10 years ago, how often have you heard someone say, "I just don't know if it's good to bring a kid up in these days. Times are getting so bad." Having one grandkid and another one on the way, I've heard it recently. And it's kind of upsetting. For one, I ain't ever enjoyed I didn't enjoy Scooter as much as I do Ellie, let's put it that way. But so that statement's upsetting there. But if we look at the Bible, if we hold our Bibles and say we 100% believe in the Bible, how many parts of the Bible was life easy? Majority of the Bible, there were a lot of hard times in the Bible. And when we look at Moses' life, it was a whole lot worse than the country is right now. Even as bad as the country's getting, it definitely looks like it's going the wrong way. I mean, they were commanded to throw their kid in the river, and let him drown and die. That's a lot worse. We haven't been told that yet. So it was a lot worse. He was, as Chris did mention, there's some providence, so that's true. There was providence involved. But if his parents didn't do what was right, would the providence have mattered? What God did later on, would that have mattered if his parents were not faithful to God and they went ahead and killed their son? There wouldn't be a Moses. God would have had to went a different route. So his parents had to be brave, had to be strong, and do the right thing. And that's what we've got to realize as parents, which, I don't think I have to really explain it, because everybody here has brought a kid more than likely and is doing the right thing and trying to have a good influence on their child. So I think we all understand that, and it's important to have that from the beginning.
We have rulers today that encourage people to kill their babies. Not the rulers themselves taking the babies, but in essence they tell them it's okay, go ahead and take your babies. Doesn't matter, live your life the way you want it.
That's right. In the last week, we've seen some crazy statements and actions by leaders and different people in the country. So there's definitely some sick attitudes and personalities out there. And it's important for us to understand that and teach our kids in the right direction and understand the difference. Another point of that, with that statement as far as bringing a kid up because the world's getting so bad, how many people did it take to turn Israel around? It took that one person. There was a lot of providence involved, and when we get to the plagues, we see miracles involved. But at the same time, when we look at providence, and we'll get there a little bit later, what's involved with providence? Definitely God's hand's involved, but what is the other part of that? Is obedience. So we've got to have that too. So we've got to do our part. And who knows, if that one child that you're bringing up is not that child later on. We don't know that. And that's what's important is if you're holding that Bible and you're trying to say you believe in the Bible, you've got to make sure you live it too. That God's going to make the right decision. God's going to point things in the right direction. There's definitely going to be hardships, bad times, because we're human and we live in the world. But at the same time, we've got to trust God for the end result. And that's what we see in Moses. And as I said, we don't know how many years his mom had that influence. But when we get further down in chapter 2, in verse 11, it says, "It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, then he went out unto the brethren and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren." So he understood at that point he was a Hebrew. He's about 40 years old at this time. And he went out to check on his brethren, to see his brethren. And when we get a little bit further down, I've got some comments, different commentaries made. And they said at that point he was ready to give up his crown or his royalty upbringing, even at that point, even before he intervened. In Hebrews chapter 11, the writer says that by faith, starting in verse 24, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So we see, comparing that with Exodus chapter 2, that when he went out, he was ready to do the right thing and be with the Hebrews, be with the Israelites. And he knew the difference between living under Pharaoh and following God with the Hebrew nation. So when we get past their birth and the upbringing, which is definitely differences, Pharaoh hasn't really been talked a lot about up to this point. When we look at the hero versus the villain aspect of it, we get to the point when Moses is now going to, he's grown up, he's been living in Midian as a shepherd. God's given him the command to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And when we look at that, we see big differences between the new Pharaoh and Moses at this time. And what we see is a compromising attitude versus a non-compromising attitude. And we can see the both. It's pretty obvious which one's which. And it's also pretty obvious the attitude behind those decisions. And we see Moses right from the beginning having a history of not compromising between right and wrong. He's always falling on the side of being right or doing what's right. And then Pharaoh, as we'll see, he makes his decisions at one point and he looks strong, but then when times get tough, his decisions based on what's easy for him or what his emotions lead him to do. So we see him compromising based on wrong things. So we kind of see Moses living by principles and sticking to those principles. Whereas Pharaoh, we see not doing that. His only principle is staying in power and being the one in charge. And that's what we see. So in Exodus chapter 2, in verse 11, we see Moses come out, check on the Hebrew brethren, and he sees one of them getting beat in verse 12 by an Egyptian. So he intervenes, ends up killing the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. And verse 15 tells us that Pharaoh hears about it eventually, and Pharaoh is looking to kill him. So Moses flees Egypt, and that's where he ends up in Midian. And what happens initially in Moses' life when he flees to Midian? All right, so he does end up with the wife there. But what happens initially when he gets there? Does he meet Zipporah's dad first?
Moses kind of jumped in to help settle a dispute, if you will.
All right. I would kind of say he got in a fight right off the bat. And starting in verse 15, it says, Pharaoh sought to slay Moses, so he fled. He dwelt in the land of Midian. And it says he sat down by a well. And the grammar here kind of talks about he didn't just end up at a well and sat down to rest. He was kind of off to the side residing there. So we don't know how long, how many days he had been there. You know, he had nowhere to live. So he was there by the well. And then it goes on to say that the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and drew water, filled the troughs to the water, to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And then when they came to rule their father, he said, "How is it that you come so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hands of the shepherds and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock." So when we look at some of those phrases there, you know, it does say Moses stood up and helped. So that kind of sounds not too confrontational. But when they get home and their father says, "How are you home so early?" He's used to them not being able to just go and get the job done and come home. So obviously, just being 7 women and a herd of sheep, they get bullied a lot, is kind of the impression you get from that. And they explain it that an Egyptian delivered them from the hands of the shepherd. So obviously the shepherds were bullying and pushing them around, and he intervened, and everything got settled quick, and they got to come home a little sooner than normal. But what we see is Moses seeing the innocent people are the victims, and he intervened on the victims. He easily could have just stayed out of the way, said, "Well, I've been fleeing for my life. I'm not going to intervene." But he intervened for the weaker people, the ones that were being bullied. So we see right off the bat that Moses, again, is choosing to do the right thing and help people in need. So we see right off the bat he's got principles that he's living by. And he's not just taking the easy road and the easy part of life. Now we know when God spoke to him from the burning bush, gave him, in the process, giving him directions to go see Pharaoh, that he was coming up with all kinds of excuses. And we'll see in a little bit, God got mad and talk about that. But once God got him going, we see Moses never wavered in his faith. He never backed down, always lived by those principles, and followed God to get the end result that God, you know, had planned and told him would be the end result. And we see that. So when Moses and Aaron go to see and confront Pharaoh, starting in verse 7, in verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your prophet." And this starts into where God starts talking about he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. A lot of times we see it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, or Pharaoh's heart was hardened. But many verses say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So what is meant by that phrase? Did God take his free will away and make Pharaoh the bad guy?
Put the right guy in the position to harden his heart. That was Pharaoh's character.
All right, so that's his character. He put the right person in. And we actually will see a verse in a little while that God says, "I raised you up for this purpose." So the right person was put in that position to accomplish this goal. Some commentaries go into the Hebrew and talk about Hebrew idioms and different slang uses of the language. And they explain, and I don't know Hebrew at all, so I kind of have to take what they're saying. But they explain it, a couple of them explained it as that phrase, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. When you break it down and look at the words that are used in that phrase, it's basically saying God allowed Pharaoh to harden his heart, or God allowed his heart to be hardened. Glenn Colley's got a series of videos on Moses on the World Video Bible School, and he explained it as God hardened Pharaoh's heart by being God. You know, if you look, I couldn't find anywhere in the Bible that explained this, but secular history, what did Pharaoh believe of himself, and what did the Egyptians believe of Pharaoh, of who he was? Correct, that he was a god, or maybe an intercessory god in between their multiple gods and the people. So he considered himself God. So when Moses comes, presents himself as a god and Aaron as his prophet, well, that's an insult and a slap in the face to Pharaoh. So that immediately makes him want to harden his heart. So I thought that was a pretty simplified, without even having to look at Hebrew and what it means. It made a lot of sense to me. So it kind of helps understand what's meant by God hardened his heart. Because as we go through, and we're not going to look at every plague because every one of them doesn't really play into the hero-villain part and such. But some of these plagues, we can see the actions and the order that God goes through them, I think, aided in Pharaoh getting a hard, and his heart getting harder as they went because of the actions. What was the first miracle that Moses and Aaron did in front of Pharaoh? All right, his staff to a serpent. And we're still in Exodus chapter 7, starting in verse 10. Moses and Aaron, they go into Pharaoh. Pharaoh wants to see a miracle. So Moses has Aaron throw down his staff. It turns into a serpent. But what does Pharaoh immediately do? All right, he immediately calls his magicians and sorcerers, and they come in and do the same thing. Now, we all know it's a trick, and it's not the same thing that what God did, but they still did it. And it does say that Aaron's snake swallowed up theirs, but it also says that Pharaoh hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them. So we see right off the bat, even though Aaron's staff or snake ate their snakes, Pharaoh still wasn't fazed because his guys that he called was able to throw sticks down and they turned into snakes. So he kind of left the room and didn't hearken to what just happened. So we can see the fact that his guys could do something like that kind of kept him that he was winning or he wasn't going to bow to another god. And then God tells Moses and Aaron immediately the next morning to go to Pharaoh because he's not going to let his people go. And what's the first plague that we see? In verse 7, starting in verse 15, it's turning the water to blood. And Moses tells Aaron to put his staff over the river, put it over ponds, stream, every body of water he puts it over, it turns to blood. But Pharaoh does the same thing, gets his magicians and sorcerers, and they're able to do the same thing. I don't know how they do the tricks, but in verse 23, it says, Pharaoh turned and went into his house, neither was his heart moved by this. So because he's able to have some magicians do a trick and everybody believes it and goes with it, we see Pharaoh's heart being hardened even more. And then the next plague to look at in verse 8, starting in verse 1, the Lord told Moses to go to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go and serve me, but if you refuse, and then he goes on to explain the plague of the frogs. And then in verse 5, Aaron stretches out his hand with the rod, and the frogs come. In verse 7, it says the magicians were able to do the same thing again. So again, we can see it building to where Pharaoh's heart's getting hardened because he's able to fight back. The frogs do overwhelm him. He does call Aaron and Moses in verse 8, ask him to go entreat to God. And Moses does. The frogs go away. And in verse 15, it says, when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and didn't heed to them or to their request. So we can see a compromise right then. It was hard. Pharaoh asked for help, asked for it to go away. But then as soon as it went away, he compromised and didn't follow through with what he said he would do. And verse 20, the flies is another plague that comes. And in verse 24, the flies are in the house of Pharaoh, all his servants. And in verse 25, Pharaoh calls Moses, says, go sacrifice to your God in the land. And of course, verse 26, Moses said, we're not staying in the land and doing it because the Egyptians don't need to see what we're saying while we're sacrificing. They're going to want to stone us. So we're going to go 3 days away in verse 27. And the last part of his statement is one that stands out. He says, we're going to go as the Lord commands us. So we see Moses living by that principle that as God commands is what he's doing. And we see Pharaoh going up and down, changing his mind with his emotions, letting his emotions drive what he's doing, and not living by any specific principles. So then Pharaoh says that in verse 28 of chapter 8 that he will let them go and sacrifice, but he says, don't go very far, intercede for me. And then in verse 29, Moses warns him that not to deceive or not deal deceitfully anymore in not letting the people go. But we see immediately Moses goes out, prays to God, and God takes the flies away, and Pharaoh again changes his mind and doesn't let the people go. When we get to chapter 10, a few plagues later, we have the plague of locusts. And again, we see the same explanation in verse 3 and 4. Moses tells him, God said, let my people go, otherwise locusts is coming. Has 2 verses. He explains how bad it's going to be and so forth. In verse 7, we see that the servants of Pharaoh start speaking to Pharaoh and said, can't you see that Egypt is destroyed? Why are you letting these continue? Let the people go. So in verse 8, Pharaoh has Moses and Aaron brought back in and starts talking to them about the situation. And he says that they can go and serve the Lord. Verse 8, and he says, who are the ones that are going? So we can already see him wanting to compromise, trying to cut a deal, if you will, with Moses. Moses said that the young and the old, the sons, daughters, and the flocks and our herds will go, for we must hold a feast to the Lord. And then in verse 10 and 11, Pharaoh starts accusing Moses of kind of coming up with an evil plan and said that only the men could go. Everyone else had to stay. And then he drives Moses out. So immediately, God sends the locusts, and we have that plague. And in verse 16 and 17, Moses calls for Aaron in haste. He says, I've sinned. Please take this away. So Moses speaks to God. But then in verse 20, we see Moses do the same thing. Or not Moses, Pharaoh does the same thing. Hardens his heart, doesn't let the people go. So we can kind of see how it's built. And, God always lets the plague go away before the people leave. And we can see the reaction of Pharaoh. And then the plague of darkness comes, and it's even explained as a darkness which can be felt. So it was definitely terrifying to them. And in verse 24, Pharaoh calls Moses and says, go serve the Lord, only let your flock and herds be kept back, but your little ones can go with you this time. So he's letting all the people go, but the animals have to stay. So again, he's compromising, but he's trying to come up with a deal that he likes or he feels like he wins. And in verse 25 and 26, Moses tells them that's not going to work. They need the animals because they're going to have to offer sacrifices, and they won't know what they're going to do till they get there, and then God gives them the commands. Yes, Ken?
And he knows if he lets them go with their little ones, lets them take their flocks and everything, what reason do they have to come back?
True.
So he's trying to keep that hook in there.
Yeah, so he's trying to cut a deal and compromise, and that's what we see. But, once we get past this plague, of course, we know the last plague, death of the firstborn, there wasn't any compromising at that point. He let them go. But I was hoping to do a PowerPoint, but the screen didn't work too well. But, if you put it in a chart form and go through the plagues in this sequence, you can see that Moses had the same answer all the way through. It's not worded the same way. But his answer is all the people and all the animals leave every time in his request. But as we can see through Pharaoh's answers, he starts out in chapter 8, he's saying stay in the land. Moses says, no, we've got to go at least 3 days and do what God tells us to do. And then in verse 28, he says, okay, but don't go very far. But then he still tries to put limitations so the plague comes. Chapter 10, he brings them in and says, who's going to go? Moses tells them. So then he tries to say, no, how about this? So we can see that compromise, as Ken said, tries to keep the hook in the people so they have to come back. But we can see that compromising attitude that Pharaoh has all through this. So we know, the 10th plague, death of the firstborn, kind of broke Pharaoh's back. and accomplished what God wanted, and he lets the people go. And as they're leaving, we see another example of Moses' principles shining through. He didn't leave anything undone when he left. And we see that in chapter 13, in verse 19. It says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under a solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. So we see Moses, once he got on the right track, started doing what God wanted, he never backed down. He didn't leave anything undone either. Went to the, even the small details of making sure to get Joseph's bones and take them with him. And then in chapter 14, the Lord tells Moses, speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-Zephon, and you shall camp before it by the sea. So we know this is, they left Egypt, they're heading, and they end up right in front of the Red Sea camping. And that's where they've stopped. So we see Moses living by his principle, obeying God by principles. And we see Pharaoh up and down, always trying to compromise. And we see the same thing in Pharaoh now that the Israelites have left. In chapter 14 and verse 5, it was told to the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people. And they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? What do you notice right off the bat as far as Pharaoh changing his mind here? Just in this one verse. Did he have any help? All right. Right. It says the heart of Pharaoh and his servants were turned. And then they start talking to Pharaoh. And basically everybody's saying the same thing. We've lost our slaves, lost our free labor, however you want to word it. And, if we look at our lives, how often do other people's faith affect our faith? Obviously, Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, we're supposed to, assemble together, come together, edify each other, and have a positive effect. But how often does people's negative faith or weak faith weaken our faith if we're not careful? So even though this is Pharaoh and non-believers, it's still an example for us that we've got to watch who we keep company with. Now that doesn't mean don't have a Bible study, try and convert others, but at the same time, you don't hang out with people just to hang out with them and let them influence you in the wrong direction. And your emotions will carry you to go against God and have that negative effect. Yes, Ken?
It kind of sounds like 21st century politics as well. Because there at one point, Pharaoh's like, I'm not going to let him go, I'm not going to let him go. And his people are saying, hey, maybe you should let him go. Then when he finally comes around and says, all right, get out of here. Now it's, oh no, look what we've done.
That's right. And staying in that same chapter, chapter 14, says that in verse 8, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel. But notice it says the children of Israel went out with boldness, so the Egyptians pursued them. So, the Israelites have seen all these plagues. They've seen what has happened. There's at least one person killed in every house, Egyptian house. No one died in the Israelites' whole camp. And so they've seen all this. They leave with boldness. They're courageous. They're feeling strong. But we get to verse 10, the very next verse, it says, Pharaoh drew near. The children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and they cried out to the Lord. So that boldness didn't last very long. They were bold as long as everything was going smooth, and as soon as they saw a problem, well, they were very fearful, and they cried out to the Lord. In verse 13 and 14, Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, shall see again no more. The Lord will fight for you and shall hold your peace. And then the Lord tells Moses what to do. It's almost as if Moses didn't know how the Lord was going to save him. He just knew he was. Because he said, I'm going to deliver you, and he had faith that God was going to do that. And then we see that he's told how to do it, or what to do. And then we see the parting of the Red Sea. So it's easy for us to see the differences here, who's the hero, who's the villain, and why they're in their positions. You know, the villain had no principles that he lived by. Everything was for his own good, or as Ken said, just like modern day politics. You know, what is the crowd pushing you to do? What are they trying to do off of emotions and so forth? What are some examples for us out of the New Testament as far as making sure we live by principles or we live that way? That's right. It's very easy for our hearts to get hard. And sometimes it'll happen without even realizing it. You know, we've got to be careful that our heart stays searching after God. And I think a lot of times we read verses and we see the words and we don't really apply the same meaning that God or Jesus applied to them. You know, Jesus a lot of times and Paul a lot of times will call false teachers ravenous wolves. And then you have a study with someone in a denomination or so forth, and, you know, I've actually had someone say, well, I eat dinner with our pastor all the time. You know, I don't see him as a wolf. You know, so they kind of ignore any kind of talk, any verse like that. And it's not our words. You're just reading a verse to them. And so we've got to be careful that we understand how the strong definition, strong meaning that God is putting on those words. And I heard a sermon once on Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, where ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. The very next verse talks about us being light of the world. You know, so we kind of go through all those verses in that paragraph together, and we don't really look at the meaning of those words. You know, we're the salt of the earth, but if we've lost that flavor, what good are we? And then Jesus immediately says, you're good for nothing and should be trodden underfoot. So basically, your heart becomes hardened or you become unfaithful and you're not that salt of the earth, giving the right example, teaching the right thing, you know, or you've fallen away altogether, anything of that nature. He says you're good for nothing. You know, that's actually a slap in the face to us if we fall in that category. But how often do we read that verse and it doesn't have that, you know, it's almost like we need to put exclamation points on that so it stands out to us. You know, but it's important that we understand some of these words, some of these verses have some strong meaning that we kind of cushion when we read them. You know, so it's important to understand that. And that we don't, you know, it's more of our life has a lot of compromises in it. You know, as soon as we start compromising, we can start losing that flavor. We quit being salt of the earth, and we're just a byproduct of something. So it's important to understand that. When we look at the death of both of these people, Moses and Pharaoh, how does both of these individuals, their death, bring honor to God? All right. In chapter 14, when God's talking to Moses, in verse 4, he says, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. And then it says, it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled. The heart of Pharaoh and his servants were turned against the people. And they said, why have we done this, that we have let them go from serving us? And then, of course, they went and chased the Israelites. So God said he's going to have honor when Pharaoh perishes, because it's going to show that the God of the Israelites conquered Pharaoh, who thought he was a god. All the people thought he was a god. You know, through secular history, we know they were the superpower of the time. And then, God comes, Moses comes and says, his God said, let my people go. And then we see God through the plagues, and, as God describes it later on, the terror that came from the hand of Moses, conquered Egypt and Pharaoh. So that's how God got honored through the death of Pharaoh. Do you have something to say, Ken?
Yeah, I was just going to say the fact that Pharaoh died when he thought he was God, says something about, Moses' God was still very much alive and active. But guess what? Pharaoh's dead.
Yep. So it says a lot. And when we look at Moses' death in Deuteronomy chapter 34, in verse 4, or verses 4 through 7, the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abram, unto Isaac, unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. So right off the bat, God says, you're not going to go into the promised land. So we see some punishment there, but that was necessary. God had to set that right example for the new generation of the Hebrew. But at the second part of that, he did show him the promised land. And it says he made him to see all of it. So there was probably some miraculous part there that he could see it from one mountain. But what part of it, or even looking at other verses, the rest of the Bible, what do we know is the positive part of Moses' death? All right, that's very true, because it says he buried him. God personally buried Moses, and nobody knows where he's buried. When we go to Jude chapter 1 and verse 9, it says that Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring accusation against him. So we can see the devil wanted to know where Moses' body was, and he couldn't find out. God kept that a secret. Only God knows where his body is. So we can see that just that one verse tells you how important Moses was, or how much God thought of Moses. When Jesus was here on earth, during his ministry, if you remember the Transfiguration, and we can see Jesus took his apostles, or 3 of them, up with him, and we have the Mount of Transfiguration, and Moses was one of the individuals there speaking with Jesus. And, you remember Peter wanted to build a temple for each person there. So we see Moses obviously didn't get to go into the physical, earthly promised land, but he obviously went to the eternal promised land. And he was actually there. He spoke with Christ, before Christ was betrayed and went through his crucifixion. So we know Moses had his eternal salvation, or his eternal prize. So we see that as definitely a positive thing. When they're in the wilderness doing their wandering, at one point Miriam and Aaron are speaking against Moses. They're jealous of his being in control and so forth. So they not even talking to Moses, but they're talking to each other against Moses, negative about Moses, and God intervenes. And in Numbers chapter 12, verse 6 through 8, he says, Hear my words. If there be a prophet among you, I the Lord will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all my house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. So we can see right off the bat, God treats Moses different than he treats other prophets. So Moses is definitely a hero when we start comparing him with other people in the Scriptures. How does Moses compare? Well, I don't know how to ask it, so I'll just say it. when we talk about Enoch, what does the Scripture say about Enoch? He was taken and was not because he walked with God. And David was known as what? A man after God's own heart. And then John the Baptist, it said, what did Jesus say about John the Baptist? I'm sorry? None greater. Of those born of woman, there are none that are greater. But then we see what God said about Moses. And in verse 10 and 12 of Deuteronomy 34, closing out the book of Deuteronomy, says, "But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt before Pharaoh, before all his servants and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of Israel." So we can see God definitely considers Moses a hero in human terms. But we can also see the reason he was a hero, because he followed God as he should. And he was faithful in all of God's ways. He did have that one sin that kept him out of the land of Canaan. But we see in all other ways he was faithful to God and lived by those godly principles. So that's a lesson for us. We're going to make mistakes, but we've got to be striving to live by those principles, and set ourselves up to live that way and not let our emotions put us on a roller coaster. When we look at Pharaoh and his magicians and how they stood up against Moses and God, in 2 Timothy 3:8, Paul says that as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth, men of corrupt minds, reprobate concerning the faith. So we see Paul referring back to the time of Moses and Pharaoh, even names two of the magicians, that Pharaoh used to stand up against, to go against Moses. And then in Exodus chapter 4, when Moses is speaking to God and God speaking to him through the burning bush, and Moses is saying, "I'm not an eloquent speaker. Pharaoh wants to kill me. I had to flee." Obviously there was some concern there of his past in Egypt. But in verse 14 it says, "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he seeth thee, he will be glad in thy heart." So we see that verse starts out that the anger of the Lord was against Moses. So what is the difference between Pharaoh and the magicians going against God and Moses, you could kind of say, going against God, because he's initially not going along with the commandment. But yet later on, God is praising Moses. All right, that's a very good point. And, we know just from Moses' reaction at the burning bush that he was acknowledging, so we know he was a believer in God already. If we look back at King David, a man after God's own heart, in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, when Samuel is there to anoint the new king, he doesn't know who it is yet, and they're bringing the different brothers in front of him. In verse 7, the Lord said unto Samuel, "Look not on his countenance or the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." So right off the bat, where God's explaining, he looks at the heart of man. He knows what that man or that person, that individual is about, and why they're making excuses, why they're doing what they're doing. In Acts chapter 1, verse 24, when they're up in the upper room and they're gathering, they're choosing a replacement for Judas. In verse 24, they prayed and said, Thou, Lord, which knoweth the hearts of all men, show whether of these two thou hast chosen. So we can see again, God knows the heart of men. He knew what Pharaoh and the magicians were doing, but he also knew why Moses were making these excuses. And when we look at the whole attitude and how Moses did change and went with the command, we can see Moses wasn't doubting what God was saying as far as God was going to free the people. God was going to do what he was going to do. He was doubting himself. And, so we can see that attitude was very important, that he had that attitude. He was doubting himself, not God. And we've got to make sure if we're letting the environment, we keep saying, this country is getting worse. If we let our environment make us fearful and we don't think God can make things work right, well, then we're on the wrong side. We don't have the attitude Moses had. He had the attitude of he couldn't do it and had all those kind of excuses. And when we look at the progression of it, Moses, Exodus 7:1, God said, I'm going to set you up as a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron's your prophet. And when it started out, Aaron did do all the speaking, or the majority of the speaking. And he had to do some of the actions for Moses, and it went in that scenario. But we see as it progressed, Moses pretty much took over. And Moses did all the talking, did all the action, and God did everything through Moses. And just as Deuteronomy 34, it says all the terrible and events that God did through the hands of Moses. So God knew the heart of Moses, knew who he was. He just had to be trained properly. So God set it up for him to be trained. So we've got to make sure our heart's in the right place. None of us can start out strong enough. We've all got to grow. Paul condemned the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 3. They weren't teachers yet. They were still carnal in their minds and going after the wrong things. And then Hebrews chapter 5, 12 through 14, the writer of Hebrews is condemning them again. They should be at the meat of the word. They're still at the milk of the word. They're not growing. And he says the only way you can make the right decisions between right and wrong is to grow to the meat of the word. So we've got to make sure we're growing and we're wanting to grow. And that's going to mean there's going to be some uncomfortable days because we're going to find out, we fixed all this stuff in our life and we're living, and then we find out, well, this part's still wrong. We just didn't know it. Well, you've got to change that too. So we're going to have uncomfortable days like that, but we've got to have the right attitude that our principles, God's principles, is what's driving our life. And that's what made Moses a hero, is the fact of those principles is what drove his life. And he followed God in every way that he was supposed to. He wasn't perfect and sinless like Christ, but at the same time, he was faithful in all the ways before God. And that's what we've got to strive for. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Or yes, Ken?
I would like to end with the one. It's good to know that I'm not the only one that makes God mad. Moses made him mad, argued with him, and yet look how he turned out. I figure there's still hope for all of us.
That's right. I'll skip a lot of notes, but we said we'd touch on providence. Does God's providence, obviously it worked in Moses' life. There was a lot of miracles we read through, but obviously part of it is providence. Does God's providence still work in our lives? And what tells us that? Or can you think of any verse that tells us that? Okay, conviction. What's a verse that tells us that God's providence still works in our life? All right, that's one. And I think you used the verse last night, 1 Corinthians 10:13, that says God is not going to allow any temptation to come upon us that we can't escape. All right, so obviously God's going to work in our lives and make sure nothing's going to be put in front of us that we can't overcome. But what are some of the ways that we might overcome a temptation? What are some commands for us? Flee. And so I just went to a concordance. There was a whole lot of verses. Flee. 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee fornication. Chapter 10:14, flee from idolatry. 2 Timothy 2:22 kind of covers a lot. It says, flee youthful lust. So sometimes something's going to be put in front of us. The answer is to just run away. You know, you look at Joseph. He ran away. Yes? That's right. So that is definitely always a good answer, is pray. Don't make decisions without putting God in that decision. You know, so, but we have to do our part. Sometimes it's not comfortable. You may want to be the David and slay Goliath, but sometimes you got to run from the problem. You know, so we've got to understand that. But God definitely does still work in our lives. Yes.
James 2, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Knowing we're going through trials with Christ, He's making us as best we can be. Providential care. He's having His work done with us. You know what I mean? It's not the easiest thing, but if you're doing what's right, it's what's best. You just got to trust that, and it is. It's going to work out.
Yep, that's true. Just as Eddie said, all things work together for good for those that love the Lord. But we've got to make sure that we trust in God and we're living by those principles. And it is 8:03, so it's a good time for us to stop and clear the way for the youngins before they get in here. So, but I appreciate everybody being here tonight and everybody's participation and attention and your comments. So, thank you.